Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Satisfying Software. Today, I have with me Andrew Harmel-Law. They are a tech principal at ThoughtWorks and the author of the book Facilitating Software Architecture, Empowering Teams to Make Architectural Decisions. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Ian. It's lovely to see you again.
Yes, it is. So, first question. Professionally speaking, what is the worst decision you ever made?
So, so this is a bit of a dodge answer. I thought for a long time it was agreeing to write a book because it turns out I thought I'd wanted to write a book for a very long time, and I thought it can't be that hard to write a book. As you know, Keen, right? So it's quite naive. It takes a lot longer than you think. Like just like a long like elapsed period of time, and the other thing I realized, I thought I knew what I was going to talk about. And it turns out when you start writing a book, there's a ton of stuff that you kind of understand, but then you need to write a book to explain it. And that's really difficult. And you discover that you think you can write, but you can't write. So then someone has to teach you how to write, and you think you can edit and structure books and all of this kind of stuff. So I don't regret it now, but it was a big, like my ego took a real battering doing it in
Yeah.
a good way, I think. But yeah, it wasn't. I came out different from when I went in.
Yes. But it's a book about, software architecture and architectural decisions, and decisions in itself for a hobby that's gotten out of hand for me. The subtitle is Empowering Teams to Make Architectural Decisions. What made you decide to write a book about architectural decisions?
So it's another good question. The thing that made me think that it needed to happen as a book was that I realized that there's lots of books that tell you about architecture. There's books that tell you about patterns. There's books that tells you about like different architectural styles. There's books that tell you about how to do like cross-functional or non-functional requirements and all of these kind of things. But there's books about enterprise architecture and things. There weren't many books. There aren't none, but there were very few books which told you how to go about practicing architecture. And so that was one thing. So I thought maybe that's something that needs to exist. And there was also a lack of books around about like something which kind of made it clear like where architecture sat and where the practice of architecture sat and who should be doing it and things. And so we'd kind of just fallen into this hole where we thought, oh, if the word architect is in your job title, then you must be doing architecture. And doing architecture is basically making decisions because you're saying lots and lots of times over and over again, you're saying, this, we need to do this or this. We need to pick a direction, and therefore you decide to go in this direction and not that direction. And so the book came from me realizing that decisions were central and that we didn't really think about it and how they related to things. We didn't think about who did it. So I thought, because I wanted to write a book for O'Reilly with a bird on the cover, I thought it'd be really cool if I could like write a book which has my opinionated version of what I think should happen. Other approaches do exist, and they're as equally good as mine. But I kind of wanted to see if I could think, make a big proposal and based on a bunch of experience that I'd had for how to get the right architecture happening in the right place at the right times.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, I've read book on architecture in general. But for me also, like, my understanding of what architecture actually is grew over time. So you said, we have to, first of all, you need to figure out what it is. And I felt that it was in the beginning, as I was taught in college, and then later on, even when you spoke to architects, I felt it was a very narrow definition of what architecture was. And like one of the things I noticed is that they talked about the things that you need to take into consideration, but also I felt that, well, if higher managements decide that you can't hire more people, then that influences your architecture. So everything involving architecture for me, it was first very narrow, which is you have the abilities and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But then as I learned more about how to do that, I learned that actually anything is, there's a lot influencing it, and we're just looking at it very narrow. And I like that. I think you sort of had the same journey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I thought, like, you're exactly right. I think people thought it was done by a very small number of people with the word architect in their job title. And it was kind of, it was a bit magical. They'd go into an ivory tower or something, like they'd disappear, and architectural thinking would happen, and lots of thinking by very smart people, and they would come out with a decision, and the decision would be right. And then I did that job, and I was like, there's a lot more guessing and like gut feel and like all of this kind of stuff, and there's a lot more, like you say, constraints and trade-offs and human being element to it. There's a lot more fallibility to it. There's a lot more. So the thing that caused the book, there was a lot more stress, because the old way of doing it, which is like people outside of the teams who are actually writing the code, kind of trying to make the best decision for something that they can see very far in the future. And I realized what you need is lots more people doing lots more architecture, lots more frequently, kind of going around, because our architectures are changing, right? So the stress of trying to do the old way of thinking really hard architecture, I was trying to do that and it didn't work. And I was like, there must be another way of. And this is where, like, so this is why you and I know each other, because your book is about like collaboratively designing software and stuff, right? Which is,
Yes.
when you design, you're making decisions. And I was like, there's got to be a way. Like, it felt like I was working with smart people. Software engineers are smart people, as are architects. And lots of people who work in software are smart. There must be a way to kind of bring in all of that stuff, and smartness and intelligence and experience and perspective. And there's even bits in my book, and like there is in yours, about like diversity, but with like a small d, right? Like, if you've got lots of people with different experiences and different skills and different viewpoints, you want that because it will make stronger decisions. So that's all mixed up in the book. So I was like, this is what we need to bring together. So.
Yeah, and like one thing I really liked is that you talk about centralized and decentralized architecture, and I really liked that. And you made it very clear, like you said, I don't mean distributed architecture, and there's a very big difference between that, between decentralized and distributed. So the way I understood it is that for me, we have domain-driven design, and I use bounded contexts in order to sort of design how we can split up business logic. And I just want to check if my assumptions are correct here. But decentralized to me seems, what I'm saying is that you have your bounded contexts, which try to solve a problem. And I have a heuristic that says one bounded context is one microservice. And I sort of, that's what I think of when you say decentralized.
Yeah. Yeah. But also, like, they're all kind of the other part of decentralized. So that's all true. The other part is like, there's no one kind of like master place, because this again is bounded context, right? Like you said, a bounded context is basically a thing that contains a model which is supporting a job or a bunch of related jobs to be done. And then there'll be other bounded contexts which contain other models which are doing other jobs. And they all combine together to produce this end-to-end system, which is the software which gives us what we want, right? But there's rarely, and we've fallen into anti-patterns, right? When we put like a layer on top of that, like an ESB, which was a disaster, and we all remember ESBs being a disaster, or we put the control somewhere else, that was bad. And what microservices do, and what DDD's talked about for 20 years, is the services should know everything they need to know, and they can do everything they need to do. Maybe they collaborate just like human beings and teams, but one's not primary over the other. They might be more important for the business or whatever, but they're all kind of independent and self-managing and maintaining. And that was something that I realized wasn't just in software and in teams, but it was also kind of an approach to architecture which did the same thing, it worked in the same way. And then finally, when I realized the biggest thing is, because the boundaries of our organizations are quite porous these days, we don't take, I used to work for a hardware supplier, so we would sell you the servers that your stuff ran on. So you had the servers, you had all of the teams, everything was in-house. And now we don't own our computers. Half of the services, I was logging on to Workday a minute ago. ThoughtWorks don't run Workday, right? That's another company. Like, our email isn't run on email servers from us, etc. So lots of things are being run elsewhere. And so why does it all need to be in one big place? It doesn't need to be in one big place. It can be spread around. but then collaborating in a way that works. And that's the hard bit. So that's
Yeah,
where those.
that is definitely the hard bit. Is this going to work? Because I always like, I feel like with my customers, I often have to say that yes, we want microservices. We want services, not micro or not nano. You
Mhm,
want
mhm.
services, that are sort of like we have this one thing where we can that we want to solve a problem for very well, and we want to create a model that fits for that. And of course, it has to communicate because it's a software system. So one of the big advantages is that we can, make it interact. So we need that, we want that. But how? If we go too big, then everything inside is just messy and we can't create a good model for it anymore. If we make it too small, we just put all the complexity in the communication.
Yeah.
And that these days is hidden. It's very much hidden, because especially if you go event driven, so like how does this still communicate is
Yeah.
so hard to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you also have that problem if you go to new customers? It's like how is this working?
Yeah, totally. Like this is the thing. It's like it's and it's always like there will be people who know, right? So like you and I, because we're consultants, one of the cool things about being a consultant is we get to go to new clients who are paying us to solve a hard problem because they've solved the easy problems themselves already, right? They wouldn't pay us to solve an easy problem. So we get there, and then there are people who know the things, but they're not necessarily the people who are at the front, or they're not necessarily the people who share all the information. Like with another big thing I realized with software architecture, you can read what's on the wiki, and you can read like all the requirements and the non-functional requirements, what we call CFRs. But what's really the architecture is what's running in production, right? Or is the business domain in people's heads. And if you're lucky, the two things are the same. And if you're super lucky, the architecture is the same as well. But that never happens. So then this is why your book exists, right? Like then you try and talk to people, and you like communicate and you collaborate and you get shared understanding and all this kind of stuff. And then you then work in a way to figure out how to have the right conversations in the right way. So with DDD, you don't overload people with too much cognitive load. That's the kind of way things split up, right? And so mine was similar. Like at the core of mine is a quote again from Ruth Mallon. And she's like, Ruth's point was that the key thing about architecture is ensuring the right conversations are happening. So you don't need to be having the conversations yourself if you're an architect. You don't need to be taking part in the conversations or even initiating them. But if they're not happening, then that's where you come along. But if they're happening, then the architecture is happening itself, right? And so that for me was super interesting. I was like, oh, okay, so it's conversations about the right knowledge, and then making sure that gets into the code, which is easier said than done. But that's software, right? That's super interesting for
Yes.
me, like getting it. And that's your book too, right? It's like, okay, cool. How do we get this? How do we collaborate? How do we get all of the information into the shared kind of mental model and then get it into software? And I think that's always been the challenge of software. But in the old days, software didn't change as much. And now systems evolve. They're a lot more broken into smaller pieces. There's a lot more teams working in parallel. Everything changes around about them faster. So it's important to kind of keep things moving and keep things evolving and all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah. So is that where the architecture advice process came from? It's like we have this scattered software system now, and we need to make architectural decisions.
Yep. So to be clear, I didn't invent the architecture advice process, and I didn't even give it its name. So there's a thing in trust organizations, which is just a way of organizing companies or groups of people, right? Organizations, because it could work in a charity as well. So, and there's a famous book called Reinventing Organizations, which talks about this. And so the advice process is anyone can make any decision as long as the people who are affected are sought for their advice, and the people who have expertise. But just advice, right? They can give, I can say, I'm going to do this thing. What do you think? You can tell me your advice. I can still ignore you because I'm making the decision, right? But that's it. I have to seek your advice. The architecture advice process is that with the word architecture stuck on the front of it, which was someone else's idea, and then you're just doing it for architectural decisions. But it works. Like combined with ADRs for like super transparency and as a thinking tool, right? As a way to, because it turns out, as we all know from our friend Diana Montalian, writing is thinking. So when you get people to write stuff down, lots of that helps people who have less experience being or doing architecture. It helps them think about architecture, and they can get advice from architects and in written words as well. The two things work really well and kind of build this socio-technical trust-based system where the teams that are collaborating on building the software kind of come together and kind of coalesce in a way that is dynamic but can react and respond to the problems that are coming along. And it works super well. Another key point, actually, which reminds me of something. In the first few drafts of the book, I would speak about people and individuals and developers. And then Trond Kjortland, who was one of the tech reviewers, he was like, the unit of development is a team, not an individual. So smart. So hopefully the book doesn't mention, like, it talks about individual people, but it talks about like teams driving decisions and architects, right, who are kind of responsible for the gaps in between the teams and the overall picture. So hopefully that made its way into the book.
I think it did. Like, I always saw it as we're just going to create a temporary team with the expertise of the domain expertise that we need, the expertise of architecture, and then whichever teams are involved, it's going to impact them, and they also have knowledge that we actually need in order to make that, and we'll just do a assemble, and then we have this temporary team who will make this decision, and then afterwards the team sort of disperses and everyone goes back to where they are. That's sort of how I saw it happening.
Yeah, it totally is. And it's very, so it's maybe not a popular word at the moment, but it's very like, in the strictest sense of the word, because people are now using, because of events, the word anarchy in a kind of, anarchy doesn't sound good. Anarchy is actually just the freedom for anybody to make decisions and to do things. So like it's the classical definition. Chaos is what people don't want, and you don't want, because chaos is complete chaos. And unpredictability, but like anarchy where people can take responsibility, and that's key, right? You don't like make decisions and then like not care about the results, but people can, like you say, self-organize for the length of time that needs to be there. There's like a book I've got called Patterns of Anarchy. And one of the key things about anarchy is that like you said, it forms, decisions are made, and then when it doesn't need to be there anymore, it unforms. And that's very key, right? So, and you'll end up with is kind of solid structures, but they're not permanent. They're just there while they're needed. And Trond again talks about this. He talks about DP2 style organizations. While there's a need, while your software is going in a certain direction, then you will have those structures. And when your software doesn't need it because the changes aren't happening, then those things disappear. And that works really well. And like I said, the reason when you described kind of problematic decision making at the start, because there's other people involved and other people have opinions, even though they're not directly affected. The reason that pops up is because those structures evolved and then didn't disappear when they weren't required anymore. So they still think that they should be consulted or involved or have approval, right? When it really doesn't. Like, if you're trying to ship software, maybe it doesn't matter. But if it does, the advice process will say, then you need to consult them. So
yeah. See, I think that's where we sort of have that's where we disagree, I think. But my knowledge on decisions comes from economics, and that's sort of where I went to research what is a decision, and how the hell can I improve this thing in my company.
Yep.
And there they say that like there is a decision maker. It's a single person. And I often get like very much struggle whenever I say that, because they're like, no, but we're democratic. It's a team decision. It's everyone decides. And I was like, yes, but even in that group, so even in your temporary team, I would say you have a decision maker who has the right to veto, and they have the right to override whatever consensus that team has reached. So there's always a decision maker, in my opinion. And maybe you agree, but I have not heard that so far.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I kind of half agree. So I think, so what you're doing is, because the decisions they don't always come from one place, which is key, right? The decisions can now, because of the advice process, anyone can decide. So a decision can arise where it needs. And you involve, like you said, the right people in the decisions. So that means that you're probably selecting people, maybe who don't all agree, but people who are relevant to the decision. And then, just like you said, even if a team is initiating it, there will be someone, typically the team lead. But when this is working well, this is a sign that it's working well. It might be like a senior developer who's got very strong opinions. And then they will drive it. And then as long as they do, like I say, and I've got like whole chapters about this, inspired in part by stuff in the books that you wrote, but also inspired by things like there's a Jam Cultures by Itzke Kramer, who is somewhere in Europe, but I'm not going to say, I'll say the wrong country. So I'm not
The
gonna say.
Netherlands.
You got the
No,
Netherlands. I was going to say
she's
Belgium.
Dutch.
Okay, she's Dutch. Okay, cool.
That was the biggest misery we had because we had some lovely books of her, but they're all Dutch. They're not translated in English.
So the reason I wrote it was I was waiting for Yitzka's Jam Cultures to be translated. So you're right. So, and this is so that like, and this is my structure of the book is like, here's the like the perfect vision of this, but fundamentally, and Sonia Nathan-Zone asked this as well. She's like, is this not just like autocracy? And it is in some ways, but it's autocracy which can pop up wherever it needs to, and it has to consult people. And the important part is because you write the decisions down as ADRs, that person's held accountable. So if I make a decision, I ask your input and you give me your advice, which is do not do this. It's going to be a disaster. Your advice is recorded in the ADR alongside me going, I completely ignore Gien and I will do it anyway. So that's the process says I can do that, right? I'm not breaking the rules, but I'm responsible. And so this is where the trust thing is. Because if I do that, then you can make another decision. You can drive a decision tomorrow, which comes back the other way. And because in an ideal, well, if this doesn't work and it falls apart, then you've got a bigger problem because people are, like seeking advice and ignoring it completely. That's bad. But what it does give is leave space for, I could be very, like, I might ask you might ask me, you're making a decision. You ask me, I'm like, and this is written up in the book. I'm like, hell no, that is a terrible idea. Do not do that. And you're like, Andrew is old and doesn't know what he's talking about. So I'm going to do it. And this is a story in the book. So we were like, so a team was building a piece of software in a client, and they were like, we're going to use lambdas and we're going to use TypeScript. And me and the other older architect were like, lambdas are bad for this. TypeScript, nobody understands. Like nobody in the team knows TypeScript. It's just going to be bad. It's going to go slow and be bad. So they did some work. They ignored us, or not ignored us. They acknowledged our advice and just went the other direction. It turns out they were right and we were wrong. So they could get rid of all of the problems we'd mentioned about cold starts. It turned out that it was massively simpler than the solution we proposed, which was using EKS, Kubernetes. It was cheaper to run. It only needed to run once a month. There were loads of things which made their decision right. And so leaving that freedom for like people to disagree and for people to fail, but cultivating the overall direction, making sure that, which is important for software anywhere, it's good. And so but the trust needs to build up. And that's why there's lots of bits in the books where if you did this completely asynchronously and there was no human interaction, which again is, like in your book, again, like collaboration is key. Building understanding between individuals and teams is super important. That's more what the practice of architecture becomes. It's like creating the space for decisions, creating the space to fail, creating the inputs and the skills to evaluate the inputs. That's where you become the practitioner, right? And then when it works, you get teams doing architecture everywhere. Mm-hmm. It gets into code, because this was my big problem in the past. Architects would do architecture, try and communicate it to teams who didn't really understand what they were talking about, and then they build what they thought they said. And this is the third thing that goes into the book, right? Alberto Brandolini's quote. What goes into production is the developer's assumption about what the requirement was.
Yeah.
So
that is definitely true. But I like to pick up on something you said. You said that we had all these reasons as to why you have all these cons
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe you already see me coming from far.
Yeah, maybe.
But that is why, so I always insist on one and more option.
Sure.
You don't need to make a decision if it's, just this, can you approve it? So you need more than one option, and you also need to analyze each
Mm-hmm.
option.
Mm-hmm.
And this, it's also not mine. I can't fetch the name from my head right now, but it's called the pro con fix list, and it's very simple, and it visualizes the pros and cons very well, but also it thinks about negating all those cons. Like, is there something we can do to make this
Yeah.
less obvious? And I might be prejudiced, but my first thought was, when you were saying that, maybe you would have figured that out if you had used that pro con fix list, that there were fixes.
Yeah, yes, I should have done. So this was the thing, because the story's in the book, because it proves that people who, like,
Yeah.
everyone assumes is correct, people like me and my client colleague, but we were wrong. But like, you're right, we didn't, and I heard about this after I'd finished the book. So because this is what's cool. You write a book and then people tell you about stuff you didn't know about. So things like, and this is what I would like for the book. It tries to be not exhaustive, because it's not gonna, and people will like come across other ideas and stuff, but it tries to be complete. So things like that, and other different approaches to decision making. So like, I list a bunch of approaches to decision making, whereas in your book mentions deep democracy. Mine doesn't, because I didn't
Yeah.
know enough about it. But like, all of these approaches are valid, right? And I think that's my big goal, and I spend quite a lot of time talking about this in the book, is the two things to be called the architecture advice process, you need to be doing the architecture advice process and ADRs. The rest you can ignore, right? It's like DDD. You don't need to do every pattern to be called DDD. Um, but what would be really cool, and it took me a while to figure out how to write this into the book, was like, I'd like people to experiment. I got there by experimenting. After I finished writing the book, I met other people who were like, oh, we've arrived at a similar destination, but with a different path, and we've got slightly different, like, they didn't use ADRs, they used RFCs, etc. But like, they ended up in a similar place, and that's cool. They'd solved the problem I saw, or similar problems,
Mm-hmm.
from a different angle. And I think that's good, not bad, right? Because it's like, okay, we've definitely the problem we've identified is a real problem. If lots of people are solving it in different ways, I think that's interesting. And there's tons of other stuff that kind of does it. So I would love people to experiment, and like, I think people are doing talks. I've seen at conferences and stuff now where they're like, well, this didn't work, but we did this and this was cool. That's amazing, I think.
Yeah, that's nice.
So yeah, it's super cool, because you're like, wow, okay, right. Hopefully they don't land a fatal blow in my book, which means my book is dead and nobody wants to read it. But it survived for 3 months so far. So
I don't think your book is going to die a very painful death, Andrew. There's good stuff in there. I like the fact that you have these decision processes, right? And it gave me more vocabulary at the very least by reading it. We say you have autocratic and you have democratic, and then how much input, and we give a completely different model on how you can make a decision. What a decision is what you call a decision process, just for the listeners or viewers. To sort of understand how it is. I call it a decision, you call it a decision process.
okay.
But I like the fact you had at least like 7 new ways that I could talk about it. Like, I always just said, not deciding is also a decision. And now I can say you're in the avoidance
Yeah, which is like, so
decision process
again,
here.
I didn't make these up. There's websites which list them, and there's more. But yeah, you're right. Avoidant is a decision-making method, which is we'll avoid making a decision until it's too late, and then time has made the decision for us, which
Yes.
happens all the time in software, right? Because people are like quote agile, not you ain't gonna need it. What's the other one? Last responsible moment. But they don't mean last responsible moment. They mean until it's too late, and then, oh, whoops, it turns out we can't do it because it's too late. So
Yeah. Or it's been postponed for so long, they can't actually do they don't have time to play with it, right? Like, they don't have time to make multiple options. They don't have time to and the one person who was willing to work on it a bit just gets their option approved by default because there are no other IDs and there's no time to create any other
Yep.
IDs.
Yep.
Sort of. Yeah. I think this sort of leads us into the rant away section. We're already talking a bit about the problems
Yeah.
that we noticed. But so like, what is, you think, the biggest problem you have noticed when it comes to architecture or architectural decisions?
So this is great. This is we're exactly where I thought we might be for the rant away. So the thing that, and this is the reason I list in my book, before I present the architecture advice process, I list a bunch of other ways to make software decisions. The reason that's there is because most decisions are made completely unconsciously or using no explicit process. So it's like a weird mix of autocratic, which is like, I'm the boss, so I tell you, and a little bit of consultative, which is like, oh, maybe I've spoken to my friends a little bit, and a little bit of consensus, which is like, as long as we all agree, it's fine, and a little bit of consent, which is as long as nobody says no. And like, as I say in the book, I don't care. Like, I don't care which of those methods you use because they all get to decisions. Some of them are, and I'm not saying this for political reasons. Like for politics, I have a very strong opinion about how like we should, participate in things. But making decisions in software, they all work. They're just better or worse, right? Some of them are fast and maybe lead to riskier decisions. Some of them are slow and perhaps lead to better decisions. And it's a balance and a trade-off. The thing that winds me up like a lot, and I see this is maybe why I shouldn't be a client, things that get in clients' way all the time, and I see this over and over again, they're making decisions, but they're not really sure what a decision is. They're not really sure why they're doing it. And they're not really sure which approach they're using to decide. They're not sure who is accountable, who is responsible, who's all of this kind of stuff. And just a little bit of clarity around that makes such a massive difference. And then like people are surprised when I'm like, oh, I was like, go ahead, use that method. I would most be happy if they made decisions and shipped software. Then we can fix the problem. But if stuff gets stuck because everyone's too scared to make a decision because they don't know, they don't want someone else to say no, or they're scared of being wrong and all this kind of stuff, that winds me up. And so that's the coolest thing about doing the book with clients and hearing what other people have done with the book. It's hearing people, things, the machine moving and architecture happening again and good software getting built. That's the best bit, right? You can see it. You can see people at these weekly meetings that are described in the book called Architecture Advice Forums and all this stuff. You can see architecture happening and you can see people learning and you can see people maybe not agreeing, but participating and working on software. That's why I got into software, because I like shipping code, right? Everyone likes to ship code. So
Yeah, I'm one of those weirdos who wanted to help people and thought that software was a good way to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you already said like that is fantastic to see. So, hey, the podcast is called Satisfying Software. So what do you think of what is satisfying software for you?
So this is the next book. So this is not about the book that I've written, but the book that I've written is kind of like the gateway to this. So I think for me, satisfying software is software that's habitable. Because when I wrote the book, my editor, Rita, said there were a few comments that I got that the book was a love letter to various people. So one of the love letters is to Don Reinertson, who wrote the Principles of Product Development Flow, which is all about like the economics of decision making. So he would love it. Decision making, which includes a heavy lean on economics. The other one that it's a love letter to is Christopher Alexander's pattern language. And so we use software patterns which were originally inspired by Christopher Alexander, but Christopher Alexander has so much extra stuff in his books. And so I tried to bring lots of that into the book. Some stuff didn't make its way in because I was supposed to write a 400-page book, and if you look at the book, it's longer than 400 pages. It was even longer, and so lots of stuff came out. But what I realized was there's like the pattern, like architecture, like building architecture is a bad analogy for software. But the fact that you build houses and live in them, and Christopher Alexander's thing is all about like living in
Mhm.
houses. He's got patterns which no one talks about, which are like repair patterns, which are like you built it, but then the people living in it are feeding back on the architecture of the house, and it evolves and changes and stuff. And I was like, this is amazing. It's not in the book, but but like, but then I realized like we can spend 8 hours plus a day in a code base. We live in code bases. So something about making that habitable, about the, like Eric Evans talks about cognitive load and all these things in domain-driven design. We talk a lot about like being comfortable and living and collaborating in all of these code bases that we work on. So for me, satisfying software, and this is what I need to figure out how to write into a book next, is like software that we feel proud of, software that we understand, software that makes us feel good about ourselves and not dumb, software that, like, again, like from domain-driven design, but also in Christopher Alexander's pattern language, it bends in the right places where it's supposed to bend, and it's solid in the places where it's supposed to be solid, and it's reassuring and fits together in a community and all of that kind of stuff with good interface and all of this kind of stuff, which you get the parallels are very similar. So I need to write another love letter, which is like habitable, something like habitable software or something, which like takes, and I think it's like it's the flip side to the architecture book. It's like the experience of writing code and how it feels, and then how you take the best feelings of code and turn that into principles for when you write the code and maintain the code. So that's a preview of the book I haven't yet written. But that for me is it, right? It's like where I want to be and continue to want to be. And I can welcome new people in, right? Because there's always someone leaving the team and someone joining the team, and we build something that people can live in. That's my.
That sounds really lovely.
I'm going to trademark that because I've just said it out loud on a podcast. But
It sounds
yeah, so
like an excellent title for your next book.
you
Yes,
did right. If I could, I should pitch it to a
you
writer.
heard it first
Yeah,
here.
so yeah, but that's that. So I need to figure out how to turn it into a book. But which as I said at the start, is harder than you think. So if anyone does that, figure out how to turn it into a book. But yeah, that's what I think, because we spend so long, right? And there's more code everywhere, right? So,
Yeah, it will not get any better, unfortunately.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Andrew, for coming and talk to me. It was really lovely. And dear listener, I will see you in the next episode.